Yeah, so I suppose there's 2 points. One is that I worked in the developing world in sustainable energy. So the idea was, well, we should be doing this at home as well as preaching about it abroad. Um, so therefore, that was one of the goals. I'm trying to make everything as circular as possible in setting up the brewery was an opportunity to actually implement this at home in Ireland. Um, so that was kind of important to me. So I'd worked with stoves, and that's how the wood-fired brewery had kind of come out. Was from my experience of working with biomass and wood stoves in Africa, basically. Um, the other element, I suppose, is that we had worked, we've always been growing malting barley on the farm, apart from a little hiatus when they were no longer collecting malting barley in this area with the closing of the local malting plant. And with that, the idea was, could we process grains and could we process our crops to make it into an end product? And so that, well, one is that the byproducts could be recirculated within the system, and but two is to create a more local system. And so that's kind of, to me, the local bioeconomy is kind of links into not shipping our products across the globe, is trying to keep the products and process them as local as possible. And so that was kind of some of the inspiration behind why we got up and going and why we set out from the outset to be as circular as possible. Malting is the crucial step between farm and brewery. And so on a very basic level, we've got starch stored in our barley, in our grains, and we're trying to convert some of that into sugars, but also create the enzymes, which is what we do in a mash process to convert the rest of the starch into sugar. So the process itself is we've got steeps, which is we steep the grain in water, then in air, water and air. So we've steep and then rest, steep and then rest. We're doing a floor malting process. So we then take that grain, put it out on the floor in a thin layer, and then we keep that moving basically. We keep stirring that by hand basically, morning, evening, noon as well, basically. Could do the middle of the night as well if we were really wanted to. And then after 5 days, we've got enough germination in the grain that we reckon we've got enough enzymes in there. Then we load the grain into a kiln and we dry the grain down. So we're drying from typically 40 to 45% moisture down to 5% moisture. It's very energy intensive. And that's, yeah, after that, we put it through a cleaner, clean off the roots and the shoots, and then that's malt. So then we bag that up and store it ready for brewing. It's not easy. But I would actually say the biggest barrier really is knowledge. There's a lot of knowledge on how we used to do things, and that's kind of lost. So the knowledge and the education out there is around using these large centralized systems. And in terms of brewing, it means using malt from these centralized systems and using hops from these centralized systems. Um, so, and as you step away from that, the common refrain will be, oh, you can't provide consistency, and oh, there'll be too many challenges, and oh, you can't mold heritage grains, they perform really badly, and all of these things. And in my mind and from my experiences, that is actually due to a lack of knowledge about using these alternative systems, be it grains or be it hops, is that we're used to and very familiar with really high level of knowledge on the centralized, linear, non-circular economy. Once you start going into the circular economy, the knowledge base is much smaller, and that's a challenge. You know, you need to re-educate maltsters. You need to re-educate, or maybe not re-educate, but you need to push for the criteria that you want out of your local grains and out of your local maltster and all of these elements. So there's an important differentiation there, and you'll get barriers along the way of people saying, no, I can't do it, it's too hard, it's not worth it, that won't produce a good grain. And you have to be convinced to actually get a maltster and get a farmer to grow them and say, no, I want these grains, I want this to be local. And you probably have to put your hand in your pocket for it as well. So not only are you taking the risk, you're also taking a financial risk. So those to me are kind of the two big barriers, really. And the financial side is the economies of scale on these large centralized linear systems. They do produce cheap malt, and that's just a reality of it. So you're not going to be using the cheapest malt out there. So you need to build that into your business model and how you operate. The opportunity is that you have a local product and you've got something with flavor and you've something differentiated from your neighbor, from different countries in the world, which I think is very important. Yeah, so say typically we would grow malt and it goes to a central collection point. It gets malted with a blend of different barleys from different parts of the country. And that provides consistency in their mind because there's a large enough batch and there's enough blending to get exactly the same parameters out of the whole thing. So when you're brewing on a small scale, they say, look, it's very important to get consistency. If you had variability between batches of malt, that could be an issue. Um, Whereas, well, I suppose my contention is if you can get grain from one field and malt with it, or from one farm, you have consistency in that it's from one place and one year. So typically between years in a large centralized system as well, they won't advertise when they changing from one year's malt to another because they'll blend and make sure that the malt reach is within specification and
Yeah.
is consistent forever. So that makes your life as a brewer much easier because it's just malt is malt and it doesn't change and you keep just brewing the way you are. So you can focus on your own brewing thing. Once you start getting variability in your grains, that makes it more of a challenge for the brewer. So you now have to adjust based on the grain. So you need to have a good relationship with your maltster or your malt supplier to say, look, make sure and tell me if you change anything, if there's a different batch, because then you have to adapt to it. And that's one of the challenges in terms of processing.
Yeah. I suppose another challenge is for a small independent brewer is at what level or scale do you have to be before the maltster or the farmer is interested in growing specifically for you?
Yeah, I mean that's a challenge. And that's typically what I would advocate is that people start small and try a little bit, try a brew, try something like that, and see if you can develop the relationship with the farmer, with the maltster. Um, Now, maltsters are mostly large. I mean, until recently, the smallest batch in Ireland was 80 tons. So that means that's not just one brew. That's a lot of malt. Um, so you do need to have a small maltster that you can deal with to actually do this on a small scale. Um, and you also need to deal with a farmer to see could he grow the grain and supply a maltster to do that. So those are big challenges, getting
Yeah.
the sense of scale that you can try it as a brewery in a small scale, but that it's viable for a farmer to try it and a maltster to try it. Those are challenges. In our context, because we're the farmers, we're the
Yeah.
maltsters,
Yeah.
we're the brewers, we can control the process. And because we're particularly a small batch, um, it allows us to develop, say, heritage grains, grow them on a small scale, and evaluate them on a small scale. And if they're successful, then we can grow them further. And now we've gotten to the stage that we're growing a field, and the farmer is much happier growing a field than 3 meters by 100 meters. So definitely, from a farmer's point of view, we're used to dealing with scale, and a maltster as well. It does want scale as well. So it becomes easier the larger you are,
Yeah.
and it just means there's more risk in terms of tons and tons that you need to have a market and you need to sell it and all of those bits.
If I recall from the day we came down to visit you, you kind of embrace inconsistency a little bit, don't you, in your beer?
Yeah, and I mean this was one of the discussions with one of the brewers. He was saying, one year we can get perfect malt in our country, and the next year we may not get perfect malt. And to him, that was a big negative. To me, I think you have to embrace the variability. Each year is a different growing season, and you may get variable grain. And why shy away from that? Why, as a brewer, why would you leave your maltster hanging for one year and just say, why would I buy that? That's different. It's a different grain quality. It may not produce your blonde lager or something like that, but you may be able to produce a beer with it. So in
Mm.
terms of keeping a local system and a circular economy, it would be worth it for you to buy that grain, but you might have to change that beer to fit that mold. And that's we embrace that variability because the idea is to celebrate nature and celebrate kind of that we do have variable weather systems. If we don't talk about it, customers will never realize that the weather changes and there's challenges for farmers. And the same as there's challenges for brewers. So let's talk about the challenges for the brewers, but equally the challenges for the farmers and the maltsters. And that's by having a slight variability between our beers and between years, as long as we're able to explain to customers and say, look, this is this year's batch. This year, the farmers had an absolute challenge and we're helping them. You know, this is producing a different beer. It's not exactly the same beer as last year, but we still believe that it's got a good flavor. It's got a different flavor, but it's good, still good. So that's up to the brewer to be able to be skillful enough to make a beer, a good beer using that grain, you know? So that is, and that's, I do, there is good grain and there's bad grain, yes. But I do challenge some of the specifications which are drawn up for large multinational corporations. Do they need to be the specifications that you need as a small microbrewer? I would challenge that. And particularly in beers that use higher protein and things like that, we add wheat to beers. So if you've got higher protein in the grain, just reduce the amount of wheat you have. Let's play with it and look at it in a holistic point of view. We don't have to always stick to these regimented views and then go break the rules of macrobreweries anyway and add wheat and oats and all sorts of other grains to it. So let's look at our raw ingredients and use them for what they're exhibiting. Be that high protein, be that whatever it is, you know.
And we have it in the wine industry anyway. We call it a vintage rather than a batch. But
yeah, exactly. You know,
I suppose when you're looking at barrel aged beers and those sort of kind of annual sort of releases, it's a little bit different than if you're doing your puffable blonde ale or whatever. So
yeah, exactly. And that's where, you know, if it is a lager or if it is a blonde ale or if it is something a little bit more robust into the amber and into the stouts, they're beers that can tolerate variability. So, and that's particularly, I actually think the major advantage is once you start barrel aging. Once you go for more complex beers, you have to think that the specification out there for malt is built around predominantly lager. But what happens when you're talking about mixed fermentation and things like that? That's where I think there's a big advantage to using more interesting grains. The single release once a year, why do you care as much that it's exactly the same as last year? You know, it's a one-off. I get the point if you're producing a pale ale and it's consistently all around once a month and you've got distribution and all those, yes. But if you're celebrating local and circular, why don't you have a beer that it changes a little bit? So that's my big point. Let's have a beer that celebrates change and weather change. Yeah, so the grain is used for animal feed, for sheep or pigs or whatever is around. And then for the water side of things, because we're a farmhouse brewery, we use the water back on the land as well. So that's maybe a challenge in terms of what chemicals we're using, and it changes our consciousness in terms of what we use, not in terms of just the cleaning cycle, but equally what happens on the far end of it. And I think this is an issue in the brewing industry that a lot of the time, bar exceeding maximum specifications, it's not a challenge once it goes out the drain, and that's fine, you know. But a lot of places will pay the same for water as they do for wastewater. So control of your water consumption and what you put into that is important to us because we're based on a farm, you know.
Where can you find efficiencies in controlling the water consumption?
It's in everything you do. Do you know what I mean? How much you're washing and recirculating. I mean, there's always a challenge or a trade-off between that extra cleaning cycle and the security, you know, the security blanket that gives versus reducing that. So that's a challenge. Do you know what I mean? So that's where your quality control is important to be able to guarantee that. You know? The other one is to brew with Kveik or Norwegian farmhouse yeast, and then you don't need as much cooling water. Saves water.
It's brewed at a lower temperature,
No, it ferments at a higher temperature. So you use less cooling water to cool your wort after the boil. So that's just a simple saving by the choice of yeast that you use. You know.
Yeah.
For us, it saves time and water, so it's great. I just think it's a no-brainer. So we are solar, hydro, and biomass. So we are wood-fired malting system. So biomass energy for the heating, electricity from the hydro, typically when it's in winter. And then, so malting is typically kind of a wintertime thing. Then for brewing, again, we are a wood-fired boil kettle. And then to run the pumps and stuff like that and the controls is all electricity, which is hydro or solar in the summer, basically. So the idea of the energy mix of the hydro and solar is that wintertime is wetter, so we have enough water in the river to generate hydro continuously, and that's via an Archimedes screw. So we have an old river going through the farm, which it used to have an old water mill. So a little bit of upgrading, but using the old technologies really. There was a water mill here, so we're using that potential energy again. And then the idea is that in summertime we have a lot less rainfall, well, we should have a lot less rainfall, so the river level drops. We sometimes have to shut down the hydro for a month or two in the middle of the summer if we have a drought. So in that period we have solar, which is the sunniest part of the year. So therefore the two technologies can kind of complement each other. Biomass, then we have native woodlands on the farm, and we manage them ourselves, and we manage them using sustainable forestry technique called coppice with standards. So the idea is that we harvest a small area each year, and we keep harvesting a different area each year. And that means we have a diversity of age of woodlands. So there's always a year when the sunlight gets to the forest floor, which means the forest flowers can flourish. And then equally, there's years where the woodland has gotten older. And the other thing is that because there are standards, the standard trees are the trees that we don't harvest on, say, a 10-year rotation. So they grow up into complete trees, and they produce seeds. So the idea is that they'll be producing seeds that will fall on the forest floor. And as we coppice in a cycle, there'll be a chance for those seeds to germinate and come up and compete. And for the forester or the person harvesting, it's like, well, if that's a nice tree, we'll let it go on to become a standard. And the standard then can be harvested for saw log timber to make benches, tables, whatever it is, beams in the brewery, things like that. So we try and use that timber and mill it on site into timber. And some of the timber in the brewery at the moment is timber that we milled on the farm as well. And then the byproduct from that can be used for heat to heat the brew or dry the malt, whatever it is. So we're trying to get the circularity as much as possible through everything we do. No, there's always little improvements that can be made, in terms of our feedstock. So we would be 100% heritage based malt. We're expanding then into wheat, rye, oats, things like that, trying to get more heritage grains to kind of complete our list of ingredients. And in terms of energy supply, we've added solar panels to kind of complement the hydro. So we're always trying to add to things to get a complete holistic picture. And so there is always incremental improvement that you can do. And that's just the way of life. And equally, once you've done something and mastered it, you'll then see that there's another technique or there's something else that can be explored to improve your circularity or things like that, Yeah, we use our own yeast at this stage, and we just harvest between brews and between barrels and repitch it. Again, I suppose it's a little bit of a saving. Why are we importing yeast all the time? It suits our brewing system because we are farmhouse beers and we are using those sorts of things, and we're trying to create variation in our beers. But yeah, to me, it's just an obvious.
Yeah.
And there's great examples of breweries that have been repitching yeast for like 50 years and longer, So this can be done very effectively. We don't always need to keep buying new yeast. And I think in terms of exploring diversity and interest, it's very useful. You can still get other yeasts if you need to, but I think we should be working around, can we reuse as much as possible?
Yeah. Is there any gaps in it then that you're kind of looking to
Yeah, there's
tackle
always
next?
gaps. I'm not going to make cans though. That's the one bit that we don't.
No.
We're not or blowing gas or blowing glass to make glass bottles.
Yeah.
I suppose one of the elements would be in terms of packaging is to do more kegs, stainless steel kegs. because then we can reuse the container. And so that is something that we're looking at. And there's always little gaps, and because we're taking it from cradle to grave, I mean, from farm all the way to brewery, we're trying to get more nutrient cycling around within that system and trying to help, and that can happen within the farm, it can happen within the malting, and it can happen within the brewing. So just always trying to improve efficiency and improve things along the way. There's plenty of little details that can be done to be improved. And I'd say one of our trials from this year will be shifting to organic grains, hopefully, fingers crossed. And so can that be a runner? It's a question mark, and we're going to explore it, and it'll push our farming, it'll push the malting, each element along the way to see, can we achieve that? So yeah, there's always little bits that you can do. Do have a green malt beer, which is made with green malt, which is malt that hasn't been killed.
Right.
It can be done. You basically need to brew it immediately at day 5. So you need to sync your brewery and the maltings, and save an awful lot of energy, but you have a different flavor from the grain. You've got kind of a lot of that cucumber sort of flavor from it, green grass, that kind of thing. So yeah, typically it's for storage and for ease of handling in the brewery, but theoretically it can be done, and I have done it. And I have to bottle that beer up basically and see what it tastes like. It's a different flavor,
Yeah. So yeah, you could do a green no boil brew, and you'd be ticking all the boxes.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, your energy consumption would be savagely reduced, but different flavors. And that's, the raw ale movement is really cool. It's a fresher beer, but it is less energy intensive, That's the thing.